But first, let's talk about Ukraine. The French President Emmanuel Macron hosted a conference in Paris designed to show that Europe and the US have the political resolve and the military means to defeat Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. Ukraine say that a lack of ammunition is hindering their ability to fight. Let's talk about this with Cormac Smith. Cormac is former strategic communications advisor to Pavlo Klimkin when he was Ukraine's foreign affairs minister. Cormac.
Nick, hello. Nice to join you as ever.
Well, thanks very much for being here. There's been some losses recently for Ukraine. Is Russia winning this war?
No, Russia is not winning the war, but I'm afraid at the moment Ukraine is not losing the war either. There have been losses for Ukraine. Most significantly, a week ago, Ukraine had to withdraw from the strategically important city of Avdiivka, where we believe, Russian losses have been absolutely massive, but the Ukrainians had to withdraw to prevent further loss of life and capture on the Ukrainian side. The problem is with the hold-up of funding from the United States and until recently blocking of EU funding by Viktor Orban, that there has been a severe shortage of funding and the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. And what we have seen is across the front line, which is over 1,000 kilometres, the Ukrainians have had to switch from offence to defence. And I would just remind listeners that the great gains that were made in 2022 when Ukraine, took back over half the land that Russia captured. The front line last year hardly moved at all, but now we're moving into an absolutely dire situation for the Ukrainians because they're running low on ammunition and in particular artillery shells to fight with.
What about personnel? Because you said that the Russians had suffered enormous losses, but they have practically an unlimited supply of potential soldiers that Putin can just click his fingers and march to the front. That's not the case with Ukraine, is it?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, there's two factors here, Nick. The population of Russia is 3.5 times the size of the population of Ukraine. But far more importantly, and from the Ukrainian side, I know from talking to friends who are both senior politicians and diplomats, and I have spoken to army people as well, every Ukrainian death hurts them as it would us here in the UK. On the other hand, we know that Putin has absolutely no compunction with feeding tens of thousands of his own people into a meat grinder. He has been doing this. There is some debate about what the Russian losses are. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense talks of over 400,000 Russian casualties. President Zelensky, in a press conference the other day, talked about 180,000 fatalities. He quoted a figure for the first time, actually, of 13,000 Ukrainian deaths. Now, that is if you just want to do the figures, that would seem a very, very significant kill ratio in favour of the Ukrainians. And, from a lot of what we are hearing from the front line, that would be true. But, I really say every death matters. And I know people who are losing either friends or sons of friends or whatever. It's on a almost daily basis that you're hearing this from people. There's nobody, I would say, in Ukraine is not directly affected by this, whereas we're dealing with a completely different mentality. And we know from history, going back to the Second World War and the war on the Eastern Front and going back to the First World War, that this is how the Russians behave. They have no compunction with, as I said, shoving tens of thousands of their own people into a meat grinder.
Now, the Russian economy is doing surprisingly well, considering how many of its people and businesses have been the subject of sanctions. How are they managing that?
Well, I think, quite frankly, I used the term 2 years ago that we needed to sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. And quite frankly, we have not done that. And, you know, there was a new raft of U.S. sanctions announced after the murder of Alexei Navalny. And again, I said in another interview, I think on this station, that again, they were incremental. So one, we are not going all in on sanctions, and we haven't yet in over 2 years. But two, we also know that Russia is effectively circumventing the sanctions, and they have many, many allies around the world who are willing to help them do this, not just their closest allies, such as North Korea, Iran, and China's role is a little bit more opaque at the moment, I would say. But clearly, Russia is managing to a large extent, circumvent the sanctions. And yes, their economy has not been impacted as heavily as we should have.
Are we in effect, sorry to interrupt, but are we in effect helping them to evade those sanctions? Because while we aren't buying Russian oil directly, we are doing it indirectly after it has been taken to a second country, like China, for instance, and then turned into a different product.
Yeah, I think Britain may well be culpable there, as every other Western ally. And, I'm not in full grasp of the detail on this, Nick, but what I would confidently say is that all of us in the West, and there's been no greater supporter and ally of Ukraine than Britain, but we need to look far more rigorously at how the sanctions are being enforced. And as I say, what we do know is there are just too many loopholes and too many ways that Russia is clearly managing to circumvent these sanctions.
One of the things that Putin said that was riling him was the advance of NATO across Europe. Finland and now Sweden have joined NATO. What's the significance of that?
Well, 2 points I'd like to make there. One is to bust the Russian lie about the advance of NATO being any part of the cause of this, and second, the significance of Sweden. Sorry, I'm being confusing. I'll come to Sweden first. It's very, very significant that Sweden's membership has finally been approved today. But if we go back to last year when Finland joined, now Finland is a small country, same size as Ireland. I often like to say they spend 17 times as much on defence as Ireland, but that's another subject completely. Finland has a small, very, very effective army, but they can call up to 1 million people within 24 hours from their reserve, and they have more artillery than Germany and France combined. It was very interesting, despite Putin's rhetoric, that the first thing that Putin did last year when Finland joined, and Finland has a border, and excuse me if I get my figures wrong, I think of 1,300 kilometers with Russia, and the first thing Putin did when Finland joined was to withdraw troops from the Finnish border to redeploy them to Ukraine. One of the great lies that Russia has told to justify this genocidal invasion has been because of NATO encroachment and NATO advancement. And we hear the great lie over and over again that, of course, Russia was promised that NATO would never expand to the east. That never happened. There was never an international agreement between the West and Russia, or between NATO and Russia, that NATO would not advance. NATO is a defensive organization, and every new nation in the East that has joined NATO have virtually begged to join NATO for their own defense, because we're dealing with the Baltics and with Poland and with countries like Finland. We are dealing with countries who have either grown up as neighbors of the Russian Federation and the old USSR, which was effectively a Russian empire, or we're dealing with countries like the Baltics, who were effectively enslaved as Soviet socialist republics. And these people, I learned when, I worked out among the Ukrainians and lived among the Ukrainians for 2 years, they're the people that we need to really listen to if we want to know what Russia is about, because they know, they grew up with it. So this point about NATO expansion being one of the causes, I well remember over 2 years ago, Ben Wallace, our then Secretary of Defence, sorry, I've got the term wrong, but you know what I'm talking about, wrote a very good article in the Times where he said that this was that the excuse of NATO expansion was a straw man, and indeed it was. And there's a number of other big lies that Russia has deployed and has been very effective with getting both their assets in the West and many, many useful idiots in the West to repeat those claims over and over. And of course, Nick, you will still hear people claiming that it was the advance of NATO and encroachment up to Russia's borders, which causes. The final thing I'd say was, had Ukraine been a member of NATO, I think it's very, very unlikely that Russia would ever have invaded Ukraine.
Donald Trump seems to be very keen on Vladimir Putin. He appears to have never met a dictator he didn't like. What do you think another Trump presidency could mean to the war?
Disaster. I think another Trump presidency, and I'm not alone in this view, would see America not only pull the rug from under Ukraine, but pull the rug from under Europe as well. It's well known that, and in fact, Donald Trump told Ursula von der Leyen back in 2020 that he would withdraw from NATO. There were many wise heads in Washington, we believe, up in his last presidential term, who probably prevented him doing some of the more extreme things like withdrawing from NATO. We believe that they have been cleared out. We have got to say, a very, very real possibility that Donald Trump will see a second presidential term. And what that means, bringing the focus onto this summit, which President Macron hastily arranged today in Europe. We have, and that's the EU and Britain and any other unaligned countries. We've got to learn to stand on our own 2 feet and to do this very, very quick, because we may have less than a year. And there is no doubt, I would go as far as to say that Putin is in, or that Trump is in Putin's pocket. And I would go as far as to say that Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House, who is single-handedly blocking this $50-60 billion of US aid to Ukraine by refusing to allow it to be taken to the floor of the House to face a vote. I would say that Mike Johnson is also in Donald Trump's pocket. So we're facing very, very worrying times. My own view is that, America for the short term may well be lost. And Europe really needs to, well, what I've said before, we should have put our arms industries on a war footing 2 years ago. We must do it now. And all I can say, I've had a number of conversations with friends of mine, with ex-military people, and there are signs that we are starting to do that in the West. And we heard President Macron say only today that if Putin were to be allowed win in Ukraine, then that would mean that we would be at war with Russia. There would be an attack. Yeah. As I am fond of saying, this is a wolf that will come to our door. I think there's a sign that people are finally waking up to this. When I said this 2 years ago, I felt it had very little credibility. There are far more people saying it, and far more experienced and wiser heads than me, I observe, are saying this more frequently now. Personally, I pray we're not coming to our senses too late, because we may well have to stand on our own 2 feet.
Cormac, very good to talk to you. Thanks for that. Cormac Smith, former Strategic Communications Advisor to Pablo